Alright, hello and thank you for tuning in. Today we're trying something entirely new for this channel. This video will be my first attempt at video essay style content. I'll be sharing some of the details of the investigation and some of the psychology behind Samuel Little and the people he killed. What's to follow will be a look at the people whose lives were ended too soon and the man behind over 60 murders across the United States whose identity went unknown or unconfirmed for 35 years. Thank you so much again for taking the time to watch this. This video's been long in the works, so it's very much appreciated, as are any comments about your thoughts on the video, what I missed, and what you'd like to see next time. So let's get started. Now, we'll get into the psychology of Little after a bit, but let me start with a brief background on him. So Samuel Little was originally born Samuel McDowell in June of 1940 to Mom Bessie Mae Little and Dad Paul McDowell. His parents were young when they had him. His mother was 16, and according to Little, Mom worked as a prostitute who was believed to have given birth to Samuel while she was in jail. He moved to Lorraine after his mom was released, where he was raised primarily by his grandma. According to author Jillian Lauren, who spoke to Little and his family, he was constantly in trouble as a kid, even going to reform school at one point for stealing a bicycle. Beyond this, though, from a young age, Little was also the victim of abuse, both physical and SA. Little also shared that at one point he was left on a street corner by his mother. This tells us that physical neglect was also present in the household. Little began to have violent ideations and tendencies in middle school and earlier, recalling that as a child he had fantasies of choking his kindergarten teacher once after seeing her stroke her neck. At the age of 16, Little was arrested and convicted for breaking and entering, for which he spent time in juvenile detention. It's unknown if Little finished his education. It's implied that his mother continued to move around the country without Little in her care, so this possibly means he remained with his grandma, so he might have, but I couldn't find confirmation on this. In the 60s, when he was an adult, he went to Florida to resume living with his mother, and as an adult, he claimed that he had worked at a cemetery and as an ambulance attendant, and according to an article with a little more context on Little, he also at one point became a competitive boxer. By 1975, Little's track record had begun to grow. He had been arrested 26 times in 11 states for crimes including theft, assault, attempted SA, fraud, and attacks on government officials. In December of 1976, Little was convicted of assaulting a woman named Pamela K. Smith, for which he served 3 months in county jail. Throughout his lifetime, he would be arrested dozens of times again for various reasons, including theft and assault, for which he would serve some time in jail. However, it wasn't until Little was arrested in Kentucky in 2012 that he would be linked to a series of unsolved murders and directly tied with the killing of 3 homicide victims in California, 3 women named Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca, all murdered in the 1980s. Finally, in the year of 2013, Little began confessing to dozens of murders, and by 2018, he had confessed to over 90 murders, of which 50 had been confirmed. We'll return to Little in a while. However, next I want to talk about the women who would go on to become part of the 35-year-long puzzle to catch the man responsible for their deaths. We're going to talk about 2 women in particular, Roberta Ann Tandrich and Rosie Hill. A brief background on the women will be shared, as well as the events leading to the discovery of their bodies. However, the details of the crime and of their deaths will be censored significantly, not only for YouTube's policies, but because the families of these women have already been through enough, and I just don't think there's any need to share gratuitous information about the criminal act itself. Additionally, some of the phrases have been censored in order to comply with YouTube's policies as well, so bear with me as I sometimes not so eloquently sidestep some of those phrases. We'll start with Roberta Ann Tandrich. She was born in 1956 to parents Robert Whitney and Rosella Huffman. She lived most of her life on LaCroix Avenue in Ohio and attended Margaret Park Elementary School as a child. She went on to marry in 1972 at the age of 16 and have 2 children. Approximately 5 years later, though, not much information could be found on her family. Roberta began having trouble with the law at a young age. When she was 12, she spent time in juvenile detention after running away from school. As an adult, Roberta was known as a friendly woman, though she continued to have run-ins with the law. She was unemployed but worked as a prostitute, and she was addicted to crack cocaine and alcohol. Her arrest records ranged from public intoxication and loitering to carrying an oversized knife in a public area, for which she served 30 days in the county jail. She also had open cases with children's services as well, which led to her kids, who were 11 and 7 years old respectively at the time, being removed from her care after she had left them home alone for over 1 day. That detail is going to come back in a bit, so I'll try and emphasize it again when we get there. Roberta was also unfortunately a victim of domestic violence. She was frequently assaulted by strangers who lived in her area or by men whom she was personally involved with, either from her line of work or otherwise. No records could be found about the whereabouts of her husband or if he was the perpetrator of any of this abuse. Roberta had reported assaults and stolen property to the police, and in 1986, a male companion was arrested after attempting to strangle Roberta in the presence of an officer. Roberta went missing on September 1st, 1991. Her daughter did not report her missing for 2 weeks, possibly due to Roberta's drug addiction and, as we talked about earlier, her subsequent history of disappearing for periods at a time. Her body was not found until September 30th, 29 days after being reported missing in Firestone Metro Park by a man who was out for a walk. Her body was badly decomposed, and based on the state of her clothing, there were indicators of possible SA. She was identified through an examination of her dentures, which were compared to her dental records. The life that Roberta led proved to be very similar to the other women who met the same unfortunate end, and as we will discuss later, will prove to be a piece of the puzzle in understanding the man behind these murders. Unfortunately, this would not happen until much later due to lack of evidence. Thus, the case of Roberta Tandrich's murder would remain unsolved for about 21 years. Next, we're going to talk about Rosie Hill. Rosie Hill was a young African-American woman who lived in Florida as a single mother to a child she had while still in high school. Rosie was another young woman suspected of being involved in prostitution, though her background differed in some ways to that of Roberta. She was an active student and had no record of causing trouble. No drug usage was confirmed for her, and Rosie was described as being fun-loving, who was part of her church, loved cooking, and loved spending time with children. Rosie's mother, upon hearing about her daughter's suspected line of work, did say that it would explain the ominous final message Rosie delivered on August 4th, 1982, saying that she was up into something and that she was unable to leave. On August 12th, 1982, her parents reported her missing, and her body was found later that month in a wooded area beside a pig pen. She appeared to have been strangled, though again, evidence recovery was limited due to the elements and the significance of her body being located next to a pig pen. I'll leave you to look up that information if you're curious. After asking around about Hill in an attempt to locate suspects, witnesses identified her as having left a bar with a man who would be identified as Samuel Little. While being interrogated in Marion County, Little asked for an attorney, denied knowing Hill, and ultimately walked without charges being pressed due to lack of evidence. In a later interview, Little would talk about how he was actually almost caught in this instance after killing her. He had the car pulled over with her in the back seat, and police pulled up to his car because it was parked on the side of the road. Little was able to convince them that they were just a married couple that had stopped off on the side of the road for some fun, and was able to throw suspicion off and leave the scene before he was questioned further. This makes it even more bewildering that he was able to leave police custody after initially being brought in. As was mentioned previously, the killings went on from approximately 1970 until 2005 all across the country. The main challenge for those tasked with investigating these murders came from the fact that there was no evidence that could be linked to a suspect other than an occasional eyewitness that saw them together, such as the case with Rosie Hill. The killer relied on blunt force, usually through punching the individual to get them unconscious. From there, he would rely on strangulation and at one point drowning to execute his victims. He would have relations with the victims or SA them, though no DNA evidence was recovered due to either none being available or it not being able to be linked to anyone. Another complication was the alarming number of murders in the 1970s and 80s that only added difficulty to narrowing down the suspect list to be a handful. Additionally, DNA evidence was not heavily utilized until the 1990s, so it wasn't the most reliable form for conviction at that time. After killing them, the rest was left up to decomposition and the elements to remove any remaining clues that could be found. But beyond the lack of physical evidence, the victims all shared very similar lifestyles. The killer had a very specific population he would target: Most of his victims, around 68 of them, were African American. A few were Hispanic, one Native American, and one transgender. Most of his victims, according to the Gainesville Sun, led high-risk lifestyles and were typically into drugs and worked as prostitutes. Women such as Roberta Tandrich, who had a criminal record, a documented addiction to drugs, and worked as a prostitute, matched the typical description for the people he targeted. Little referred to his victims as grapes on a vine, noting to officers that he avoided people who would be immediately missed and stating, "I'm not going over into the white neighborhood to pick out a little teenage girl." We'll talk about the victims he picked and the significance of that a little bit later on. There are a couple instances during the investigation of these murders that Little had been interrogated, but again, not enough evidence was found to link him to the murders. At one point, he even stood trial for the murder of two women, Melinda LaPree and Patricia Mount, both in 1982. He was found not guilty due to lack of conclusive evidence for Mount's case, despite fibers linking him to her, and he was not indicted for LaPree's murder. Patterns, however, were eventually made, and Little ended up on the radar of several police agencies across the country who had Little on their suspect list. Given his transient lifestyle, it was difficult to keep track of where he was, but an extensive criminal history with incidents lining up with the murders being investigated led police connecting Little to the cold cases. In 2013, he was convicted for the murders of Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson Everett, and Guadalupe Apodaca. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. However, it wouldn't be until 2018 that he began confessing to over 90 murders between the years 1970 and 2005, only after receiving an agreement from law enforcement that he would not face the death penalty under any circumstances. Samuel Little served his time in California State Prison, where he remained until his death in 2020 at the age of 80. During his time, he continued to provide more and more evidence, linking himself to dozens of unsolved cases across the country. Now, I want to end this episode with a little exploration of Samuel Little and his psyche. This is based off of information gathered from psychologists, interviews, police officer statements, and the details of the case. For what it's worth, I am a licensed therapist. I do work with mental health and have the ability to diagnose. However, I am approaching this case as an observer. And while I may not have anything beyond what's already been contributed by psychologists, I do think it's worth talking about the details of who he was and his past to offer some context into the man Little had become. To be clear, this is not to be seen as an excuse, rather it's just insight to help us better understand the man who was labeled as one of the United States' most notorious serial killers. Beginning with Little's childhood, it doesn't take an expert to see that it was less than ideal. As was mentioned previously, he suffered physical abuse and SA and was frequently neglected by his caretakers, including his mother, who worked as a prostitute. Now, while he was left in the care of his grandmother for a time, it seems that at some points he did end up back in his mother's care, so again, there was no consistent and safe family dynamic. The crimes against women and female-presenting individuals is likely symbolic to the neglect he received from female figures. Aggression towards women, as was said, began early in childhood. Recall what he said about his kindergarten teacher and having fantasies of strangling her after she had touched her neck. Obviously, the fact that most, if not all, of his victims were prostitutes or engaged in some deviant behaviors only increases the connection of these people to his mother, who worked as a prostitute. It is unclear if there is any history of mental health disorders in the family, nor is it known if his mother ever abused drugs. If she did abuse drugs, this only further adds to the understanding of the victims he chose. Additionally, if drugs were abused while his mother was pregnant with him, there's a chance this could have led to developmental consequences. Having likely not developed secure connections to a caregiver as an infant, it's also possible that he would have met the diagnostic criteria for reactive attachment disorder, though again, this is all guesswork as I was unable to locate much information about his time as a child, let alone as an infant. The role of strangulation and drowning is something to explore here as well. A study conducted by Annie Kim, Eric Beauregard, and Julian Chopin out of Canada explored 451 cases of murders that align to the SA and crimes committed by Little and analyzed common use of strangulation in such cases. Again, bear with me as I try to sidestep the landmine that is YouTube's content guidelines, so just try and work with me on this here. The use of strangulation for his victims lines up with the vulnerable nature of the crimes like the essay factor, and reflects some insight into the psyche of the perpetrator who may fit the description of a sadist or someone who gets pleasure or excitement from violence or brutality of that nature. Little, while speaking with police after being convicted, admitted that essaying and ending the lives of these individuals was satisfying to him. There is a suspected control element of strangulation as well. Obviously, I'm not an expert on this, but when it comes to using a weapon, it seems to me like a way to distance the self from the attack versus using hands, which seems much more personal. After watching interviews with Little, he explained that he never would use a weapon as it would not be as enjoyable for him. He fixated on the neck of the individual, which aligns not only with how he killed his victims, but also with the steps prior to killing them. We spoke earlier about Rosie Hill, a young woman in Florida that he had killed, and prior to killing her, he had taken her to a bar where likely food and or alcohol was consumed. Police would comment in interviews that watching his victim swallow was almost like foreplay to him. And Little himself even said that the necks of these women were a deciding factor in who he pursued. We saw this fixation play a role in early childhood for Little, once again talking about his kindergarten teacher where he had fantasized about strangling her after she had touched her neck. Little was relatively organized, and as was said before, he targeted very specific populations. While I do believe there is a link between the people he killed and his own childhood, it can't be overlooked that the people he targeted fell into populations that would not have received excessive media coverage. Most of the women or female-presenting individuals he killed were persons of color. With the first killing taking place in 1970, it is likely that Little used the media's discrimination towards persons of color and the fact that they led shady lifestyles to his advantage. Or at least, whether intentional or not, it did work to his advantage, referring to these individuals as grapes on a vine that would not be missed in interviews. He committed murders across the country, making it hard to track him specifically, and there is very little evidence left, so the crime scenes were not sloppy. There was intention there. So while it's possible his attacks were impulsive, there was a large element of planning that went into it. Again, it's important to note that impulsive is not to be confused with not intended, as during interrogations, Little said that he approached these individuals with the intention of killing them. Finally, there is the fact that he confessed it all. While he was linked to several cases, lack of evidence did not make it conclusive, and in fact got him free of charges in the cases of the two women we discussed earlier where he was linked to their deaths. It was Little himself that confessed to a majority of the crimes linked to him. Additionally, if you watch the interviews where he talks about the crimes, he has held on to an alarming amount of details. He would just be given the name of a town, and during the interrogations from that alone he could recall the details of what the victim looked like, what they had eaten prior, where they were, and how he had ended their life, including the steps leading up to that. That he confessed, and that he held so many details even decades after the crime, points to a strong suspicion that Little could be classified as a psychopath who wanted credit for his crimes. We covered a lot of information here, and I hope to some extent it made sense. This is a case that while it received a lot of news coverage and documentation, I hadn't heard of this until about 8 months ago when I started working on this for YouTube, after going down a YouTube rabbit hole, as happens to so many of us. If you managed to sit through my rambling and make it to the end, thank you so much. Again, this was my first time attempting a video of this format and this type of content, so any feedback you have about how it turned out, what information I missed, or what you might like to see next time would be very well received and very well appreciated. I will see you with whatever we do next here, and again, thank you. Take care.